Ukraine and Russia appear to be on the brink of a bigger war. How did we get here? And why did the Western media not see this coming? Now that the ICC has issued arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and his ex-defense minister, comes the Israeli chorus that the International Criminal Court is anti-Semitic. And 3 years into the Taliban's takeover, Afghanistan's media is in shambles.
Afghans understand what it means to resist.
We speak with an Afghan journalist operating at a safe distance in exile. The United States and Russia, the world's leading nuclear powers, lurched a few steps closer to a direct conflict this past week. The decision by President Joe Biden to allow Ukraine to fire U.S. missiles into Russian territory, which Kyiv then did, has triggered an escalatory response from Moscow. The Kremlin now says it has lowered its threshold for using nuclear weapons, while Western embassies in Kyiv have closed temporarily amid warnings of Russian strikes there. This escalation may have taken Western news audiences by surprise. The news coverage they've been getting is focused largely on the potential benefit of longer-range U.S. missiles to Ukraine's war effort, with the warnings of a possible reaction treated as an afterthought. Biden's decision comes as Donald Trump, who is less supportive of this proxy war, prepares to take over the White House, and as Russian forces continue to push further into Ukrainian territory, where on one key front in this information war, Russia continues to turn the screws on Ukrainian journalism, hunting reporters down, kidnapping them, jailing them, or worse. 1,000 days after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, almost 3 years into a war fought by proxy, came an escalation not enough people had foreseen. Missiles supplied by the US and the UK launched at targets inside Russian territory, known in the news business as a development.
Ракета в цель не попала. Да, что-то повредило, не больше, не меньше того. Вопли поднялись, типа, надо срочно им немедленно ответить. Да, при этом...
Cries that Vladimir Putin's press secretary answered by raising the nuclear option, saying that is now on the table. Then the president, ostensibly addressing the Russian people, put out this message, intended for Western leaders.
Мы считаем себя вправе применять наше оружие против военных объектов тех стран, которые позволяют применять свое оружие против наших объектов.
Effectively, what Russia is saying is that Russia doesn't just see these airstrikes within its territory as being part of the war between Ukraine and itself. It sees it as part of a war with the United States. So we are coming closer and closer to direct war. And the Western media has not adequately informed people about the risks here.
Ukrainians still have a lot of hope, but our army is exhausted. People are exhausted by missile attacks and drone attacks during the night. And the world is also tired, and we don't have enough attention on what is happening in Ukraine.
This latest escalation is rooted in American domestic politics. Joe Biden, in the dying days of his presidency, is upping the stakes in a proxy war that Donald Trump has disapproved of. One that Ukraine is losing in terms of territory seized by Russia, which continues to destroy the country's energy infrastructure with winter and sub-zero temperatures coming. It is a war on journalism and culture, symbolized by these vacant chairs, arrayed in a square in Kyiv, symbolically emptied of Ukrainian human rights activists, cultural figures, and journalists captured by Russian forces or killed. Journalists like Victoria Roshchina, who the Russians acknowledge died in their custody last month.
Victoria Roshchina was one of the most bravest journalists I ever met in my career. She was just 27 years old, And she had a mission because she was able to travel to occupied territories and provide information what is happening. Editors asked her not to do so, but she said someone has to do this terrible work. She also won the prize as a courage journalist of International Women Foundation. And I asked her to go to this ceremony to New York, and she said, no, I'm going to this occupied territories. She had this vision, she had this mission.
It's been 2 months since her death in Russian jail. She was arrested in August 2023 while she was going in the Ukrainian occupied territories through Russia. Russia admitted that she is detained. And in Taganrog, in southwest Russia, we know that Ukrainian civilians are detained there. They are tortured. There is no access from lawyers. Then she was supposed to be exchanged in a swap. And then we learned that she died in Russian prison. This is an example of the consequences when independent journalists want to work. They are arrested and then they disappeared. And it can lead to tragedy as it was for Victoria Roshina.
Ukrainian journalists trying to report on their own government also face challenges, some of which date back to before the war. In 2021, Ukrainian authorities banned 3 TV networks whose owner had ties to Vladimir Putin, channels that were critical of President Volodymyr Zelensky's government. Following Russia's invasion, Ukrainian mainstream media largely coalesced around a consensus and rallied behind Zelensky. 6 major networks came together, each producing parts of a rolling broadcast branded the United News Telemarathon, a pooling of resources many observers called a positive, even necessary development.
Попри значну перевагу ворога у живій силі та техніці, наші оборонці відбивають штурми противника.
Now, the Telemarathon is widely criticized by journalists, press freedom organizations, and even Ukraine's allies at the European Commission because it severely limits opposition voices. And Ukrainian journalists working outside of the Telemarathon, mostly with smaller, more independent outlets, have to be careful.
There is no black and white picture in Ukraine. What used to be opposition media was branded as pro-Russian, flatly banned. The editors and the owners were squeezed out of Ukraine. Criminal cases were opened against them. The main threat journalists are facing is not really going to prison or getting arrested. The very simple thing the authorities can do to a male journalist is send him a draft notice, send him to the front. This is being used as a tool against Ukrainian journalists.
The Ukrainian media landscape in general is very dynamic and is speaking about all issues. Questions about the end of the war, how to end it and so on, are discussed in the Ukrainian media. This is not a topic that is not tackled. Sometimes, yes, there is a question of self-censorship. Journalists are asking themselves, does this topic need to be covered? How can I cover it? What will be the consequences?
Whenever a country is in the middle of a war or it comes under attack suddenly, civil liberties tend to get repressed, and typically press freedoms are constrained. And so in Ukraine, the intimidation of journalists has been called out by the Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, the International Press Institute. And what we're seeing in Ukraine is that it's very much starting to mimic, in terms of press freedoms, what we've seen in Russia over the past few decades.
Which doesn't quite square with the Western narrative, neither on Ukraine as a symbol of liberty, nor its resistance, its prospects of victory. Although this exchange on a U.S. news channel this past week provided a glimpse at another aspect of this conflict and the money the U.S. keeps sending Ukraine's way.
All that money, that $40 billion a year, that's not a check we're handing Zelensky. All that money is paid to U.S. defense contractors, making our defense industrial base stronger.
It's helped U.S. businesses.
NATO leaders have acknowledged this war is at least partly about bleeding Russia, draining it of its resources, economic and military.
We want to see Russia weakened.
That has not come to pass. Add it all up, and it's no wonder that international news audiences, whose support is so critical for the continued flow of weapons from west to east, are confused about how we got here.
In order for Zelensky and Ukraine to win this war, they need to be able to defend themselves. So release the missiles long range as well.
Years of lopsided news coverage can have that effect. And talking tough is easy when you're at a podium in Washington or a news studio in London, thousands of miles from the front lines.
Western media have been pivotal in getting us to the point that we're in, partly through the fog of war, partly through ignorance, but partly also through deliberate distortions by leadership in the United States and elsewhere that have warped our understanding of what is going on. Putin, as horrible as he is, has been open to negotiation. Now, the Ukrainian leadership sees negotiation as a type of surrender. That makes sense on some level. You want to fight until victory. But in reality, what that's meant is that Ukraine has suffered terribly, and its future is very bleak.
Western media was telling its audiences what the audiences wanted to hear instead of what the audiences needed to know. They created this mythological bubble, a totally delusional image of Ukraine's capabilities of defeating Russia. This cartoonish image in which Russia is a colossus on clay legs, which is going to collapse very soon. Russian regime proved very resilient. Russian economy proved very resilient as well. Nothing is falling apart in Russia, whereas Ukraine is living through an endless catastrophe.
A momentous development this past week, the International Criminal Court issuing arrest warrants against Israel's prime minister, its defense minister, as well as a Hamas military commander. The allegation in all three cases, crimes against humanity and war crimes. Tariq Nafi has been following the reactions inside Israel.
This is the first time the ICC has issued arrest warrants for a Western-backed leader. It's also the first time that Israeli political figures who've become accustomed to operating with near total impunity during this genocide have faced some kind of accountability. In Israel, where polls say Benjamin Netanyahu is unpopular, but where there is overwhelming support for the war on Gaza, the warrants have had the effect of unifying the country.
It is falsely accusing me, the democratically elected Prime Minister of the State of Israel, of deliberately targeting civilians. This when we do everything in our power to avoid civilian casualties.
Even the Prime Minister's political opponents have described the ICC's move as moral blindness, a historical disgrace, and reward for terrorism. That reflects a narrative widely held among Israeli citizens that international institutions are rigged against the country, and, as Israeli officials keep repeating, anti-Semitic. The discussion within the Israeli media followed a similar pattern. We couldn't find a single voice on TV who reflected on the substance of the accusations leveled at Israel, that it is systematically committing war crimes.
בוקר טוב לחברי בית הדין הפלילי הבינלאומי בהאג. שוב קפץ לכם הפיוז האנטישמי, מצאתם יופי של פרצה, לצאת נגד יהודים בצורה פשוטה ובלי להתלכלך.
And finally, the national broadcaster Khan had this segment on all the countries around the world, 124 in total, where Netanyahu and Gallant would be at risk of arrest. And they noted those warrants may have long-term implications for all Israelis.
ההשפעה עלולה להיות מיידית על כל אחת ואחד מאיתנו. מדינות יחששו לעשות עסקים עם מדינה שנגד הראש שלה הוצא צו מעצר על פשעי מלחמה.
As that Israeli journalist alludes to, the world just got a lot smaller for both Israel's leaders and potentially many of its citizens.
Thanks, Tariq. Moving to Afghanistan now. Over the years, throughout the U.S. occupation and the country's experiment with democracy, the Listening Post has examined the media landscape there. With the Taliban back in power, we're taking a look at just how much the situation has changed. Journalism in Afghanistan has always had its difficulties, but its high point came during the years of democracy and that Western military presence. Ever since the Taliban's return, just over 3 years ago, that freedom has been crushed, to the extent that we struggled to find any journalist in Afghanistan who would speak to us openly on the record. So we went with someone in exile, Lotfullah Najafizadeh. As the former head of Tolo News in Kabul, Najafizadeh has long championed journalism and diverse media. Now, through Amu TV, a satellite channel broadcasting from the U.S., he continues that fight, collaborating with reporters on the ground and offering content that is banned by the Taliban. We spoke with Najafizadeh about working in exile and trying to keep the spirit of Afghan journalism alive.
Around 3 years ago, I went from being a journalist working in Afghanistan for one of the biggest private TV newsrooms to being a journalist in exile. The media in Afghanistan, which we all worked very hard to build, has really regressed. And now, living outside my country, I feel a sense of determination to carry on, to keep some sort of diverse media alive for the people in Afghanistan.
They're getting a look at new video showing the Taliban inside the Afghan presidential palace there in Kabul.
Working in the media in Afghanistan has never been easy. Afghanistan, for many years, was one of the deadliest countries for journalists. During the years of international military presence and then our transition into democracy, the media opened up in ways that we never thought were possible. When I started working for Tolo News, it was more than just a job. It represented the transformative essence of Afghanistan that had been ruled by the Taliban throughout the 90s, but saw a new era after 2001.
But what are the reasons behind such attacks? Why do you think it happened?
I headed a news channel, but the Afghan media scene was very diverse. We promoted music and culture. We hosted presidential debates. We traveled across Afghanistan and showed the diversity of the country and its people in a way that many Afghans had not seen before. We knew that this media openness would not last under the Taliban. Since August 2021, media freedom in the country has been in a free fall. We have dropped from 121 on the World Press Freedom Index to 178. The Taliban have imposed many oppressive laws, and you can see that effect of them when you turn on the TV in Afghanistan. There is almost no room to critique the government. In fact, you cannot even speak about Taliban's senior leaders without using their religious titles.
The Afghanistan Islami Imarat, the Difala Sarparast Wazir, Maulavi Muhammad Yaqub Mujahid.
Radio stations in Mazar have reported that questions on call-in shows are monitored. The Taliban are even demanding phone numbers of callers who are critical of the regime must be passed on to them. The media is expected to serve as an extension of the government. For female journalists, the situation is even more dire. Firstly, they're not allowed to work in the state media. It's almost entirely men in the state media offices. In the privately owned media outlets, women can be employed, but with restrictions. If they are appearing on TV, they must cover their entire faces. Only their eyes can be seen. And they are forbidden from interviewing male subjects. And they are barred from most Taliban press conferences. A female journalist with a male cameraman is often asked to stay behind closed doors while her cameraman is allowed to go for an interview. The latest blow to our media ecosystem came with the new law that effectively bans any footage of living beings, humans and animals. According to the Taliban's interpretation of Sharia law, representing living things on a screen is against Islamic teachings. This law has caused a lot of backlash. Many Afghans are not in agreement with it. However, in provinces like Takhar, in Kandahar, in Helmand, the law has been fully implemented both on state broadcasters and on local channels. Government officials do not speak on camera. You have this absurd situation where you're watching the news with random shots of buildings and cars while voiceovers narrates the stories of the day. In places like Kabul, there is a debate going on about this law. Media workers that are trying to explain to the Taliban that, look, media is also a tool for your political survival. They're hoping some exceptions can be made since it is in the interest of the Taliban, not because of a commitment to free media and the flow of information. My colleagues who remain in Afghanistan work under really tough conditions. I cannot sit here and criticize them if I don't do something myself. So some of my colleagues joined me and we established Amu TV here in the United States. Amu TV is a small operation. We are largely funded through private donations from people who believe in free press in Afghanistan. We have a network of journalists who work undercover from Afghanistan. But we don't just do news programming. We do music, soap operas, cultural shows, and so on. Basically everything that's banned by the Taliban. The response has been overwhelming. We have this call-in show where people contact us over WhatsApp. We're getting 3,500 calls during 1 hour of a daily live show.
مکتب تا صنف 11 را خواندیم دیگه بعد از طالبان آمدن نتونستیم.
Our audiences in Afghanistan can watch us because even though the Taliban has a lot of control on the ground, they do not control the skies. We transmit via satellite, and in Afghanistan, most of the private channels use satellite as well, so viewers watch a lot of TV that way. A survey conducted only 6 months after our broadcasting began put us ahead of many of the major channels in the country. Afghans understand what it means to resist and persist. Our nation has gone through so many different challenges. People have died in pursuit of a better future. And I personally feel a sense of duty to honor the resilience of the media in Afghanistan. We have seen what an open media space can be, and we don't want to lose it entirely. So while our colleagues inside Afghanistan strive to do what they can, we on the outside make our efforts as well.
And finally, for years, liberal American news outlets have been talking up their resistance to Donald Trump, benefiting hugely from the engagement that covering him generated. But times have changed. This past week, MSNBC morning hosts Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski, two longtime critics of Trump, revealed that they had just paid Trump a visit at his Florida residence in Mar-a-Lago.
And for those asking why we would go speak to the president-elect during such fraught times, especially between us, I guess I would ask back, why wouldn't we?
As recently as September, Joe Scarborough likened Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler. Given that the president-elect has repeatedly threatened to strip broadcasters of their licenses over news coverage he doesn't like, those outlets are already treading more carefully. But as MSNBC can now tell you, recalibrating one's position can cost you viewers. The ratings for that morning show have taken a dive. That's a news audience sending a news organization a message.